The mist clung to the mountains like a living thing, wrapping the pines and stones in a damp silence that seemed older than the hills themselves. By the time Clara reached the narrow dirt road that led into Graves Hollow, her car's headlights barely pierced the fog. Locals had begged her not to go, said that the hollow didn't forgive trespassers, but curiosity had always been stronger than caution. She'd come chasing whispers, chasing the story of two women who lived alone, deep in the woods, and the strange man they were said to share. When she arrived, the cabin appeared out of nowhere, its roof sagging under the weight of time, its windows clouded with grime. An old woman greeted her, smiling too warmly for someone who hadn't seen a stranger in years. Her daughter stood behind her, silent, her pale face half hidden in the doorway. There was something uncanny in the way they moved, like one shadow trying to mimic another. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of smoke and earth. The old woman spoke of her husband with a reverence that bordered on worship, while the daughter's eyes flickered toward a dark corner of the room each time his name was mentioned. Clara thought she saw movement there once, a shape hunched low, as if listening. That night, when the wind rose and scraped against the cabin walls, Clara woke to the sound of two voices murmuring softly. Both spoke to someone unseen. Both called him husband. And somewhere in the dark between their voices, another breath answered. The story begins with Clara, a young journalist from Richmond whose fascination with unsolved mysteries often draws her to the darkest corners of forgotten America. Her latest assignment takes her deep into the Blue Ridge Mountains, a place where fog rolls like a living spirit and old families still keep their secrets buried in the earth. She had heard rumors in the newsroom, whispers of a secluded family that lived far beyond the reach of modern civilization, people who spoke to no one and came down from the mountains only when the moon was new. The rumors claimed something unnatural bound them together, something that made even the locals lower their voices when the family's name was spoken. Clara, driven by curiosity and the lure of a story that could make her career, ignored every warning she received and set out alone with her camera, notebook, and a restless determination that bordered on obsession. The deeper she traveled, the more the landscape seemed to swallow her. Paved roads turned to dirt tracks, then to narrow paths that wound through silent woods where the sunlight could barely break through. The air grew colder, the trees older, and the sense of being watched stronger with every mile. Occasionally, she passed weathered cabins that leaned against the wind, their windows boarded up as if to keep something out or in. Locals she tried to question at gas stations or diners only shook their heads when she mentioned the family in Graves Hollow. They muttered about curses, about screams in the night, and about people who went looking and never came back. Their eyes told her they believed every word, but Clara dismissed it as backward superstition. By the time she reached the foothills of the hollow, her phone had lost signal, and the GPS had given up hours earlier. Still, she pressed forward, following a hand-drawn map given to her by an old man who hadn't wanted to let it go. As dusk settled, the mist rose from the valley floor, moving like breath from the mouth of something sleeping beneath the earth. Her headlights barely cut through it, and more than once she thought she saw shapes flitting between the trees, figures that vanished when she blinked. The world grew smaller, quieter, until it felt like she was driving through a dream too thick to wake from. Somewhere beyond that veil, her story waited, and Clara couldn't help but feel that whatever truth lay hidden in the mountains was already aware of her arrival. The warnings began long before Clara ever reached the hollow. In every small town that bordered the Blue Ridge, she found the same uneasy silence when she mentioned the place. At first, she thought it was rural superstition, the kind of fear that clings to isolated towns where stories grow like vines over truth. But the more she asked, the more she realized this wasn't simple folklore, it was terror born from experience. People spoke of Graves Hollow the way one speaks of a graveyard that never stays quiet. They said the trees there whispered names at night, that lights flickered in the forest even though no one lived close enough to make them. Some claimed they'd heard a woman crying for help, but when they followed the sound, it turned into laughter that didn't belong to anything human. An old man at a roadside diner told her that the hollow was cursed long before the Civil War, when a family settled there and never left. He said the land refused to let them die, that the mountain took what it wanted and kept it. Another warned that the place fed on grief, that once you stepped inside, it found what hurt you most and used it to keep you there. Clara wrote these words down as quotes, not as warnings, though a small voice inside her had begun to whisper that this story might be different. She laughed when the waitress crossed herself after mentioning the hollow, but later that night, she dreamed of a cabin standing in a sea of fog, and a woman at the window smiling without eyes. By the time she reached the last town before the trail vanished into the wilderness, no one would speak to her directly. At the gas station, a young attendant filled her tank in silence and left a small charm made of twigs and twine on her windshield. It was meant to ward off spirits, he said, but his voice shook as though even saying that much had drawn their attention. The mountains loomed ahead, tall and patient, veiled in a mist that never lifted. Clara could feel the temperature drop as soon as she turned off the main road. The woods seemed to close in around her, dense and silent, the air thick with the smell of wet leaves and decay. Even the birds had gone quiet, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. Each warning she'd ignored now echoed in her head, but it was too late. She had crossed into the edge of Graves Hollow, where the line between the living and the dead blurred, and the stories the locals feared to tell waited to be proven true. After hours of winding through the mountain's narrow dirt trails, Clara finally found what she had come for. Hidden deep in the forest, half swallowed by overgrown vines and mist, stood an old cabin that looked like it had been forgotten by time itself. Its wooden beams were blackened by age, the porch sagging under decades of neglect. The forest pressed close around it, as though trying to reclaim what once belonged to nature. She parked her car a few yards away and stepped into the cold air, her boots sinking into the damp earth. The silence was so complete it made her ears ring. For a moment, she wondered if she'd stumbled into a world that no longer breathed. Then, from behind the fog, came the faint creak of a door. An elderly woman appeared in the doorway, her thin frame wrapped in layers of faded shawls. Her eyes were sharp despite her years, and her smile stretched too long, as if it had been practiced rather than felt. "You came all the way up here?" the woman asked, her voice rough but oddly calm. Clara introduced herself and explained that she was writing about the old families of the Blue Ridge. The woman nodded slowly, as though she had expected her. "Name's Marjorie," she said. "Not many people find this place." As she spoke, Clara noticed movement behind her, a younger woman standing in the shadows of the cabin. The daughter stepped forward just enough for the light to catch her face. Her name was Eliza, and she was beautiful in a way that felt unsettling, like a face painted too perfectly on porcelain. Her skin was pale, her eyes dark and reflective, her hair falling in waves that looked untouched by wind. What struck Clara most wasn't her beauty but her resemblance to Marjorie. They shared the same high cheekbones, the same faint scar along the jawline, the same measured way of blinking, as if time itself had folded the older woman into the younger one. Eliza spoke little, only nodding when her mother did, her gaze never quite meeting Clara's. As they invited her inside, the air grew thick with the smell of burning wood and something metallic. The cabin's walls were lined with old portraits, faces that looked so much like Marjorie and Eliza that Clara felt a chill crawl down her spine. It was as though the same two women had lived here again and again, trapped in different bodies across generations, each one watching the next from behind painted eyes. Inside the cabin, the sense of unease deepened with every passing minute. Clara tried to shake off the feeling that something was off, but it clung to her like the heavy scent of the burning logs. The more time she spent observing Marjorie and Eliza, the more she noticed how eerily alike they were, not just in appearance, but in movement, tone, and even breath. When one lifted her hand to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, the other did the same, almost in perfect sync. When Marjorie paused in her speech, Eliza's lips moved silently, mouthing the same words a heartbeat later. It was as if one was the echo of the other, trapped in a rhythm that neither could escape. Clara tried to convince herself it was coincidence or the product of years spent living in isolation, but something about it felt deeper, unnatural even. Their resemblance went beyond the surface. They shared the same faint scar beneath the chin, the same mole near the left temple, and the same almost imperceptible limp when they walked. The longer Clara looked, the harder it became to tell them apart. When she commented on their similarities, Marjorie smiled with that same strange, too perfect expression and said, "A mother and daughter should always reflect one another. It keeps the blood pure." The words sounded innocent, but there was an edge to them that made Clara's stomach tighten. Eliza avoided her eyes then, her fingers nervously twisting the hem of her faded dress, as though the statement had exposed something forbidden. The cabin itself seemed to share their strangeness. Every mirror was draped with cloth, every reflective surface hidden. Only one small mirror remained uncovered in the corner of the kitchen, its glass warped with age. When Clara caught a glimpse of it, she thought she saw not 2 but 3 figures standing there: Marjorie, Eliza, and a third shape looming just behind them. But when she turned, there was no one else in the room. Both women stood side by side, staring at her with identical expressions, their heads tilted slightly as if they were waiting for her to ask something. When night fell, Clara could no longer tell if the resemblance between them was coincidence or curse. Their laughter was the same pitch, their words flowed as one voice, and when the candlelight flickered across their faces, it was as though she was watching one woman split in 2. The thought struck her then that perhaps she hadn't met a mother and daughter at all, but rather 2 halves of the same person, one aged, one young, bound together by something that defied understanding. As the evening deepened, the cabin began to change character under the flickering glow of the firelight. Shadows stretched across the walls, distorting the shapes of the furniture until everything seemed to move with a pulse of its own. Clara sat quietly at the small wooden table as Marjorie and Eliza went about their nightly routine, boiling water and stoking the hearth as though her presence were nothing unusual. Yet something felt wrong. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of being outnumbered even though only 3 chairs stood at the table. Every now and then, Clara caught the faintest sound: a shuffle of footsteps on the floorboards above, a breath drawn just out of sight. At first, she thought it was the creak of an old house, but the sounds came too deliberately, pausing when she paused, resuming when she spoke. The unease sharpened when she noticed the shadow. It appeared faintly on the far wall, dark and tall, cast by the firelight. It wasn't hers, nor did it match either woman's. It was the outline of a man: broad shoulders, sloped posture, head bowed as though listening. Clara blinked hard, thinking it a trick of the flames, but when she glanced back, it was still there, unmoving. She looked to the women for explanation, but neither acknowledged it. Marjorie continued stirring the pot with deliberate calm, while Eliza stood frozen beside her, eyes flicking toward the wall and then quickly away. When Clara asked if someone else lived with them, Marjorie's lips curved into a thin smile. "It's just us," she said, her tone soft, almost rehearsed. "We don't get visitors." "Not anymore." Her gaze flicked to the darkened hallway behind Clara, and for a brief moment, Clara thought she saw a door there, just slightly ajar, leading to a back room where a faint light pulsed like a heartbeat. She tried to ignore it, but every time she glanced at the wall, the man's shadow was still there, shifting slightly, as though breathing. Later, when Marjorie excused herself, Clara tried to engage Eliza in conversation. The younger woman's voice trembled when she spoke, and she refused to meet Clara's eyes. "He doesn't like strangers," she whispered before catching herself, as though the words had slipped out by mistake. "Who?" Clara pressed, but Eliza only shook her head, her expression full of fear and guilt. The cabin suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker, and from somewhere within the walls came the unmistakable sound of slow, heavy breathing. Clara turned back to the fire, but the shadow of the man was gone, leaving only the faint echo of movement in the dark. That night, the cabin seemed to come alive with sounds that didn't belong to the living. The wind outside howled through the trees, but beneath it, Clara could hear faint murmurs coming from the other rooms, soft, rhythmic voices rising and falling like a prayer. The fire had died down to embers, casting only enough light to paint moving shapes along the floor. She sat awake in the old guest bed, her notebook open beside her, listening. At first, she thought it was just the 2 women talking, but the longer she listened, the more she realized there was a third voice, low and masculine, joining theirs. The hair on her arms stood on end as she strained to catch the words. It was then she heard it clearly, both Marjorie and Eliza whispering the same name, each with a tone of devotion that made her blood run cold. They both called him our husband. The words were spoken with reverence, almost worshipful, and the way they echoed through the thin walls filled the cabin with a sense of something unnatural. Clara's pen slipped from her fingers as she leaned closer to the door, heart pounding. The old floorboards outside her room creaked as if under a man's weight, slow and deliberate, passing by her door and fading down the hall. She held her breath, listening, too afraid to move. The sound stopped near the front room, and for a moment there was silence. Then came the whisper of laughter, two women's voices melting into one, followed by the deep rumble of a man responding. Clara's rational mind struggled to explain it. There had to be another person in the house, someone they hadn't told her about. But the memory of Eliza's trembling voice earlier that evening returned to her. He doesn't like strangers. The words had carried a warning, not fear of a living man, but of something that should not have existed. Slowly, Clara rose from the bed, every step creaking in protest. She crept to the crack in the door and peered through. In the dim firelight of the front room, she saw Marjorie and Eliza kneeling by the hearth, their hands clasped as though in prayer. Between them stood a space, empty except for the faintest shimmer of movement in the air, like heat rising from a flame. Marjorie's voice broke the silence. "He's here," she whispered, and Eliza's head tilted in eerie unison. The air grew colder, heavy enough to choke. Clara stumbled back, slamming the door shut. In the suffocating dark, she could still hear them speaking to him, pleading, praising, loving, and somewhere beneath their voices, a man's faint chuckle slid through the wood like a breath from the grave. The following morning, Clara could barely shake the feeling that the night before had been real. The strange whispers, the unseen presence, the way both women had called to a man she never saw, it clung to her like the mountain mist. Determined to find proof, she decided to investigate quietly while Marjorie and Eliza tended to their morning chores outside. The first place she turned to was a small shelf near the fireplace, cluttered with dusty books, yellowed letters, and an old family Bible. Its pages were brittle with age, but what caught her attention wasn't the scripture, it was the handwritten notes scrawled in the margins. Names, dates, and places, all belonging to the same family, Graves. Some were crossed out, others rewritten. She noticed one name repeated more than any other, Thomas Graves, husband of both Marjorie and Eliza Graves. The entries listed two separate wedding dates, one nearly 30 years apart, yet both tied to the same man. The last date ended abruptly in 1894, followed by a shaky line that looked more like a scar than ink. Confused, Clara stepped outside and asked Marjorie about him. The old woman's expression stiffened. "My husband," she repeated softly, then smiled in that strange way again. "He's been gone a long time. But he never really left." Eliza, standing by the well, turned sharply toward them, her face pale, her eyes wide with something between fear and guilt. The air around them grew tense, and Clara quickly changed the subject, pretending not to notice. But the words haunted her. Gone a long time, yet never really left. Back inside, she searched for more evidence. Behind the Bible, she found a small box wrapped in linen. Inside it were fragments of old photographs, black and white portraits of a man with hollow eyes and an unnerving smile. His name was written on the back of each photo in fading ink, Thomas Graves, 1887. What made Clara's stomach twist was that in each photograph, the man stood beside a different woman. One looked exactly like Eliza, though the date on the picture placed it decades too early. Another was unmistakably Marjorie, younger then, her eyes brighter but just as haunting. Clara realized, with growing horror, that the women in the photographs weren't generations apart, they were nearly identical, almost copies of one another. That evening, as the light faded and the mountains disappeared behind the fog, Clara pieced together the unthinkable truth. The man they spoke of, the one both women claimed as their husband, had died more than a century ago. Yet in this cabin, his name was still whispered, his shadow still lingered, and his presence was treated not as memory but as devotion, as if death itself had never been enough to separate them. As Clara continued digging into the family's history, the darkness of Graves Hollow became impossible to ignore. The records she found in the small library of the nearest town were fragmented, yellowed with age, and often illegible, but a disturbing pattern emerged. Every generation of the Graves family had been linked to disappearances, people who had ventured too close to the hollow and were never seen again. Newspaper clippings, old court records, and town ledgers told the same chilling story. Travelers, wandering hunters, and even curious neighbors had vanished, their fates recorded only in whispered speculation. The more Clara read, the more the hollow seemed less a place and more a living entity, feeding on curiosity and leaving a trail of silence in its wake. She found an 1873 report of a young man who had come seeking work in the mountains. He had been seen talking to Marjorie's mother at the time, a woman whose resemblance to her daughter and granddaughter was uncanny, almost supernatural. Weeks later, the boy was reported missing, his last known location marked near a creek that ran through the heart of Graves Hollow. In the margins of the report, someone had scribbled a note, * never cross the bloodline. * Clara's pulse quickened as she read the words. It was the first explicit warning she had seen, a clue that the disappearances were not random but tied to something deeply rooted in the family's legacy. Further research revealed patterns of marriage, inheritance, and control that seemed ritualistic. Every major family event, the birth of a child, a new marriage, the passing of a family member, was accompanied by strange accounts of people vanishing or returning changed. Some were said to have gone mad, others to have taken their own lives, and still others simply ceased to exist in town records entirely. Each disappearance circled back to a physical or emotional connection with the Graves women, as if their home, their very blood, demanded a price. Clara began to see the outlines of a horrifying truth. Graves Hollow wasn't just a remote cabin, it was a focal point for a family secret so dark that it had been preserved across centuries through fear, manipulation, and possibly something beyond human understanding. Late that evening, Clara traced the map of these disappearances and realized that nearly every one led to the same valley, the same isolated hollow that now loomed outside her car window. Her heart raced as she drove closer to the cabin, the fog thickening with every turn, and she began to understand that what she had feared as superstition was in fact evidence of a deliberate, repeating pattern. The hollow had a history of consuming those who got too close, of erasing lives in a way that left no trace but the lingering shadow of its inhabitants. And the mother and daughter she had come to observe were at the center of it all, the silent keepers of a lineage that thrived on control, obsession, and the disappearance of anyone who might challenge it. As the nights stretched longer in the cabin, Clara felt the oppressive weight of the house pressing down on her. The shadows had grown more active, flitting along the walls and ceiling in ways that no wind or trick of firelight could explain. It was during these hours, when the forest outside was swallowed in darkness, that she began seeing glimpses of him, the husband both Marjorie and Eliza claimed as theirs. At first, it was only a flicker in the corner of her eye, a figure standing just beyond the edge of the firelight, watching silently, its presence suggested rather than fully revealed. But as the hours passed, the glimpses became clearer. He was pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into her, yet he moved like a shadow, almost unreal, disappearing whenever she tried to focus on him. The women's behavior shifted around him. Marjorie became more possessive, subtly moving to block Clara from certain rooms or angles of the cabin, her hands lingering on doorframes as if warding something away. Eliza, meanwhile, alternated between fascination and fear, her eyes constantly darting toward corners where no human should have been. Clara began to notice patterns. When the firelight flickered, when the wind tapped against the windows, the figure appeared, then vanished the moment either woman looked directly at him. Their interactions suggested an intimacy that was both tender and terrifying, as though they were conversing with someone entirely real yet physically absent. One night, Clara awoke to the sound of a deep exhale right beside her bed, the warmth of breath brushing her cheek. She froze, unable to move, listening as Marjorie's voice rose softly from somewhere in the cabin. "He is patient. He waits." Eliza whispered in response, barely audible, "He never leaves." Not truly. The words chilled her, not merely because of what they implied but because of the certainty in their voices, as though they were speaking not of memory or imagination, but of a presence that transcended life and death. Clara's camera, which she had been hesitant to use, began to capture anomalies. Shadows that didn't correspond to anything living, faint reflections in the warped mirror that suggested a third figure, and light distortions that hinted at movement where there was none. The more she tried to rationalize what she saw, the more impossible it became. In the quiet moments between fire crackles and sighs of wind, she began to feel that the figure was aware of her observation, aware of her intrusion. The presence of the husband was no longer subtle, it dominated the house, surrounding her, marking the women's devotion and asserting a silent, omnipresent control that made Clara understand, with an icy certainty, that she was in the midst of a force that neither logic nor fear could fully contain. By the third night, Clara's sense of reality began to fracture. The cabin had grown suffocating, every corner filled with the weight of unseen eyes. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, and the faint movements she had glimpsed before were now unmistakable, an eerie rhythm that suggested something breathing, waiting, and watching. The whispers of Marjorie and Eliza had intensified, their prayers and hushed conversations circling around the name of their husband, spoken with the reverence of someone in communion with a god rather than a man. Clara felt herself teetering on the edge of comprehension, understanding that the presence they both adored was not a memory, not a ghost, but something far more insidious, bound in flesh or in spirit, or perhaps in both. Compelled by a mixture of fear and curiosity, Clara ventured into the shadowed corners of the cabin she had not yet explored. Beneath the loose floorboards in the center of the main room, she discovered a trapdoor, its hinges rusted but still functional. The air that rose from the narrow staircase beneath smelled of decay, of damp earth and something metallic. Each step downward was a chorus of creaking wood, and Clara's heart pounded in her chest like a drum of warning. At the bottom, the flicker of her flashlight revealed a small chamber. And there, lying on a crude bier of wood and cloth, was the source of the women's devotion, the body of a man preserved with a meticulous, almost ritualistic care. His skin was pale and stretched tight, eyes closed as though in eternal sleep, and yet there was an undeniable sense of awareness about him, a presence that seemed to fill the room despite the stillness of his form. Marjorie's voice floated down the steps before Clara could speak, calm and eerily tender. "He has always been with us." "Always," she said, and Eliza echoed her from somewhere in the shadows, "He never leaves." Clara realized then the horrifying truth. Both mother and daughter had maintained an unbroken bond with this man through death itself, their obsession defying every boundary of nature and morality. The preservation of his body was more than devotion, it was a ritual that bound their lives together, a cycle of madness and worship that had persisted through the years, unbroken and unchallenged. Clara's mind raced to comprehend the implications. This was no mere story of inheritance or obsession, it was an existence sustained by secrecy, by the deliberate maintenance of a presence that should have been gone. The husband's body beneath the cabin was the linchpin, the anchor of a terrifying devotion that entwined the mother and daughter in a reality separate from the world outside. Their lives, their voices, and the shadows Clara had witnessed were all manifestations of this unholy bond. The truth pressed down on her like the weight of the mountains themselves. The husband had never truly left, and the hollow, with its silence, fog, and history of disappearances, had been protecting this dark secret for generations, hiding it from the eyes of anyone who might intrude upon the unending cycle of obsession, reverence, and horror that defined the cabin and its inhabitants.